Take Back Your Health Now, Episode 37.
You're listening to the Take Back Your Health Now podcast, the show that interviews the top doctors, athletes, trainers, and entrepreneurs to help you find the Holy Grail of health. Now here's your host, Dr. Dan Margolin.
This is Dr. Dan Margolin with another segment of Take Back Your Health Now, where we pull out all the stops in search of health's Holy Grail. We're very excited to have Dr. Colin Campbell on. Dr. Colin Campbell is a PhD, has been at the forefront of nutrition, education, and research. Dr. Campbell's expertise and scientific interests encompass relationships between diet and diseases, particularly the causation of cancer. His legacy, the China Project, is one of the most comprehensive studies of health and nutrition ever conducted. The New York Times has recognized the study as the Grand Prix of epidemiology. Dr. Campbell is the co-author of the best-selling book, The China Study, Startling Implications for Diet, Weight Loss, and Long-Term Health, and author of the New York Times bestseller, Whole and the Low-Carb Fraud. He is the founder of the Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies and the online plant-based nutrition certificate in partnership with eCornell. Dr. Campbell, how are you, sir, and welcome to the show.
Good. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So, Dr. Campbell, just explain to us, the audience, what is the China study and why did you undertake it?
Okay. I got to add some clarification first. China Study is the name of the book. And it certainly does focus a little bit on the study that we did in China. However, the actual research that we did in China, to which the New York Times referred, it's only one part of my story. It's only one chapter out of 18 in the book.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Yeah, please tell us more.
Yeah, but so the book, if you're referring to the China Study, the book that is, which has now sold more than somewhere between 2 and 3 million copies.
Wow.
40 different languages. But in any case, that the book refers to a lot of research that I did prior to the study in China. And it was the study in China, obviously involving humans, was an attempt to determine whether or not the information that we saw in China with people was consistent with what we were learning in the laboratory.
Okay.
So it made it much stronger than just doing the study alone, the human study in China alone.
Right.
So it focused on, I had to go back a little bit. I started my career, as I mentioned to you earlier, privately, that started my career over 60 years ago in graduate school on diet and health, and I've been doing the same thing ever since. And at that time, my views of nutrition and health were exactly opposite what they are now. I came from...
So you, over the years, you've changed.
Yeah, I came from farm milk and cows, so animal protein was the big ticket item as far as eating is concerned in those days.
Sure.
But then through the years, involving work in the Philippines and a lot of work in the laboratory and elsewhere, I came to learn that consuming excessive protein was not exactly a good idea. That in turn generated a grant from the National Institutes of Health, specifically the National Cancer Institute, that lasted for the next 27 years. And so that work really generated a lot of publications, had a lot of students. And what we were interested in doing in that case was to see if, in fact, this observation that I had made in the Philippines, that, high protein diets might not be as good as what we thought they were, that we got into doing that research. And it just was a watershed, essentially, over the years and learning something about the relationship between nutrition, let's say, and cancer, as well as other diseases.
Dr. Campbell, so prior to that, what was the viewpoint of the medical industry? Was it that proteins from animal were very good? That was like the high tide of good nutrition, or what was the viewpoint at that time?
Well, that story goes back to the early 1800s. Protein was discovered in 1839. And it was called essentially the stuff of life itself, if you will.
Wow.
The idea of consuming protein was prominent throughout our entire history. Most people sort of first and foremost wanted to make sure they got enough protein. And it really dominated the field for this entire time, 150 years or more. And so it's just the way it is. And
Right.
I was part of the same game plan when I started my career, because I went to the Philippines, in fact, with my senior colleague, and organized a nationwide program of feeding malnourished children. And we wanted to make sure they got enough protein. And
that's why. So you got to the Philippines because you're actually going out there almost on a mission to help feed. Oh, I understand. Okay. That makes sense.
We were working with the Ministry of Health. And as a matter of fact, we were setting up so-called mothercraft centers all over the Philippines, actually.
Wow.
And they're working with these malnourished children. And that's when, as I say, I got the impression that higher protein diets amongst a fairly minor number of people and families was associated with a higher rate of liver cancer, if you will. And so,
wow. So you start to see this in the Philippines, and you start to say, hey, it starts to change your viewpoint as to what's going on.
Right. That was in the 1960s. And it was odd because it was completely opposite what we were intending to do in the Philippines, and everybody else in my field were doing elsewhere, making sure everybody got enough protein. But we got to a point, at least in the laboratory, that we could turn on cancer. Like this is laboratory animal studies in most of those early years. We could turn on cancer with increase in protein intake, and the protein we were using was the main protein of cow's milk. It was very dramatic.
Wow, that's tremendous.
It was very dramatic because we could get 100% response, for example, by elevating the protein intake up to about 20% of total calories. 100% response. Then if we put them on the low protein diet, it turned the cancer off, and it went to 0%. So when I'm not talking about a 10 or 15% change, I'm talking about all or nothing.
Dr. Campbell, you're saying that with 100% certainty, you put somebody on or these animals on a dairy, like a milk diet, at a certain level, 100% chance they're getting cancer.
Yes, that's right. And there's animal studies, mind you, but we did it in many different ways. I mean, we did those studies over and over and over again over many years, and we learned a lot of things. I mean, we learned, for example, that the role of nutrition, in this case, the effect of protein, one of the main roles of nutrition is to control gene expression.
Okay.
That's a big ticket item idea. What it suggests is that, regardless of what genes we may or may not have to cause this or that problem, if we eat the right food, we keep things under control.
So even if there's a genetic predisposition to some sort of cancer, if you control the nutrition, you control the cancer.
Right. That's what we saw in the laboratory. But then subsequent to that, there are human studies that have been conducted that confirm that idea. When people move from one society to another, for example, and they don't change their genetic predisposition, if you will, as they change their diet, they change the risk of getting cancer and heart disease and all the rest. So that's one of their sort of so-called principles that I got out of my research. Another one was the assumption that we tend to have, a very simplistic assumption, we still do these days, very simplistic assumption that if you're investigating the effect of one nutrient or one chemical, whatever, on some kind of response, we tend to assume that we can identify the mechanism, causing that effect, if you will, the mechanism.
Okay, just explain that a little bit more.
Well, there's an assumption in medicine, especially, but in research too, that the relationship between cause and effect involves also one mechanism, one explanatory mechanism.
Oh, okay. Right.
I mean, that's the basis for the entire pharmaceutical industry. Because the idea there is if they can identify the biochemical mechanism for some effect, if you will, and they're trying to modulate that effect, maybe turn it off, they can develop a drug, to attack that site, that mechanism.
Right. They're not recognizing all the other factors that might be involved. They're saying it's this one specific thing, and it's really not that one thing.
Exactly. We call it now, these days, I call it reductionism.
Okay.
It's the basis for the entire medical practice community, I must say, just about the entire medical community. Certainly it threads throughout the biological research community as well. And what we learned in the work that I was doing was that really is not true. That the protein effect on increasing cancer, for example, involved a whole lot of mechanisms. Every time we looked for one, we found one. That was those were many studies done over a period of 10 to 15 years, and it published quite extensively. And when animal protein, for example, is consumed, it turns on all the bad genes and downplays and regulates the good genes. So it's an overwhelming sort of observation in a sense.
I mean, it's actually, I mean, it sheds light on why some of the pharmaceutical companies are so fixated on just looking for one specific thing and not recognizing that there are other effects, or how they can put you on one medicine and then not recognize the side effects that are caused later on, because they're really not looking at it. They're just looking at that one specific pathway, if you would.
Exactly right. And it explains, quite frankly, why something like 80 to 85% of all drugs first, taken to the market, if you will, fail. I mean, that's their estimate. They will say that.
Is it that high? It's 85%.
Yeah, that's one estimate has been made. I know it's very high. It's in that territory. But the second thing is, as we also know, all drugs have side effects.
Right.
And so it also explains why drugs have side effects. Because what we're trying to do with the drug approach is taking one chemical and somehow it's supposed to thread its way through this extraordinarily complex system to hit that target that is suspected of being responsible for the effect, right?
Yeah.
And it can't travel through that maze of reactions without causing disturbances along the way. And so the whole concept of the use of pharmaceuticals, our work really just was brought into serious question. In contrast, nutrition, which is also made up of countless, I really mean that, almost an infinite number of chemicals that could be regarded as nutrients, sort of working together in an integrated fashion. If we consume the right kind of diet, it can do more than all the pills and procedures combined.
Dr. Campbell, let me ask you a question. Just when you look at the complexity of the human body and these systems that you're talking about, did you turn around and say, like, wow, there's got to be a God, or there's got to be something that designed this because it's too extraordinary? Was there ever that moment, or what's your feeling on that?
It's an interesting question. I'm secular. I'm not any specific religion.
And that's why I'm asking the question, actually.
Yeah,
yes.
I know, but I had to say what I had to say because I have lectured a lot to faith-based groups, especially the Adventists who like to work a lot. And when I do that, I'm often told that they know where I got my ideas from, and all I need to do is look up. And so, actually, in the more recent years, later years, I've become quite fascinated with the whole idea because it basically is beginning to shed light on the interface between science and religion, and it begins to shed light on why it is that for some reason, science and religion has lived in conflict for generations.
Right.
I don't think it's necessary. To be honest with you, that's another topic. But
sure.
Since you asked the question, yes, there almost looks like there's a mastermind.
I mean, it almost just, even me hearing about it and having studied certain things, I just say it just seems that it's such a complex mechanism. Let's go to this concept, and along the same lines, genetically modified organisms. We've got companies that are now genetically modifying different species. I know there's the concept of taking salmon and mixing them as a chimera with cockroaches and releasing them into the environment. I mean, it just seems like, are we really supposed to be doing these things? Do we really know what the consequences are going to be down the road?
I don't know whether we're supposed to be doing them or not. I don't know whether that's part of the nature of scientific progress. I can't answer that question, but I do have to say this. We are now involved in a massive experiment on nature and on the human population in particular, for which ultimately we cannot predict the consequences. And there are going to be unintended consequences. We do have enough information now to know that that's true. And I'm really concerned with the entire GMO exercise.
Yeah.
I think it's going in the wrong direction. We may be creating what could turn out to be eventually a really crisis, an epidemic, for which we will not be able at that time to know where it came from. Because we don't have to be able to go back and figure out that.
Wow. Oh, yeah. Listen, when you started doing these studies in the 60s, there was no such thing as genetically modified foods. You were basically looking at animal proteins. There was no changes in it. The plant, everything was pretty much the way nature had intended it. So we're throwing, even on, and at that time we hadn't figured it out. So now we're adding to that this complexity. It just doesn't seem to me that it could work out well for us.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, my research was focused on a very simple question that was, perturbing to us who were my senior colleague and I, who were trying to set up this program in the Philippines. And I had to, I had to resolve that simple question, whether animal protein was as good as I thought it was.
Yeah.
But, as we got into that, especially we got into the sort of basic biochemical mechanisms and studying it that way, it just was it was a windfall,
Wow.
information that was not in textbooks.
Dr. Campbell, when you come back and you publish this information, what's the reaction and where do you go from there?
Good question. I published a lot. I've got 50 some publications in the very best journals, actually. And I was very much involved in policy development, actually, in this country, testifying before congressional committees and doing all these kinds of things, being on expert panels of various and sundry kinds. And all my research was funded by the taxpayer, I should say, none of it by industry. So, and on top of it, I had tenure from a very early age. So I was really in an ideal position to speak my mind and tell what we found. But at the same time, I was also the target.
You were?
Yeah, I have been the target of some things that really the public would just not even find believable. And this is things behind the scenes. Because what I'm doing, what our research showed, I shouldn't say what I'm doing, but what our research really shows, it really seriously questions, first off, the entire food industry that we've become accustomed to. It also seriously questions the pharmaceutical industry. And questions the whole paradigm, essentially, of what we think is supposed to be health. So I talk about this. I've given lots of lectures here and abroad. And I speak a lot to medical schools, actually. Most of my lectures have been in medical schools or medical conferences. And
what type of reaction do you get from the students?
Well, it's interesting. These are not students. These are faculty, too.
Oh, faculty. Okay.
Yeah. So I at first, when I was, I've always spoken to medical schools to some extent. But let's say 4 or 5 years ago, I was really getting more invitations. At first, it was mostly quiet, silence. I was thinking I was messing up. They're not asking me the key questions. But it turns out, of course, no medical school teaches nutrition adequately. So no doctors that really understand this aren't prepared to understand it. They just find it surprising. But then, interestingly, some started warming up and they started trying this idea on their patients. And they saw spectacular results, absolutely spectacular results very quickly.
Wow.
When I speak to medical schools, I have in the last 2 or 3 years, I've gotten standing ovations when I'm introduced. I get standing ovations when I finish.
Wow. Wow.
And this involves obviously people who are attending the lecture are ones who are probably committed in the first place. I'm sure they don't get that from those who don't attend.
Right.
There is that bias there. But in any case, I'm really gratified to see the growing interest in the medical community.
Well, this is really your life's work. I mean, you're starting to see that it's actually germinating. It's coming of age right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just spoke last week, gave a series of lectures to, I don't know what there was, 1,200, I guess, people. And gosh, the response I get, especially upon completing the seminars or the lectures, is a bit overwhelming. There was it was quite an elderly gentleman there, 94 years old, who had been teaching at the Cornell Med School for years and quite a distinguished fellow. He came to speak, and he basically was saying that this work was equal to that of Charles Darwin.
Wow.
It just, I mean, I don't say that to...
No, I listen. Listen,
what the facts are, but it turns out that this idea, as I've gotten involved in it, it reaches deep into our consciousness, and it gets right into the history, asking questions about, how did we get into this state of affairs? I talk about that, and
Well, let's go with that. How did we get into this state of affairs, and how would we get into such a state of affairs that somebody like yourself, that's coming out with the facts and really doing some studies, would be attacked? Like, who's attacking you? How did we get into this state of affairs?
I asked that question of myself back in the 80s. I was on a National Academy of Science committee that wrote a report. It was the most sought-after report in the history of the Academy, actually, called Diet, Nutrition, Cancer. That report came out in 1982. It created a furor. We were produced the first institutional report to suggest that eating more vegetables and fruits and grains was a good idea, if you will. And I had no idea. I mean, it's very simple, straightforward. It was a big book. I mean, it was a book of 500 pages or so. So it was done seriously by 13 people on this committee. But what I had taken a fairly much of a lead in that, became the public face of some of that, because I had given testimony before congressional committees, and I was on PBS and stuff like that, and featured in some magazines.
Wow.
And so I became sort of the target of that. And my God, they came out of the woodwork. And so, I was really puzzled. I said, what's going on here? This is ridiculous. And so then in 1985, 86, I spent a year at Oxford University working with my colleagues on the emerging China study at that time. And while I was there, I was just curious, why is all this hostility? So I got into the libraries in Oxford and London, and spent the whole good part of that year just pouring through this old stuff, asking myself this question: where did this come from? So finally, in 1986, I wrote a paper. It was quite a lengthy paper on all the stuff that I learned, and I thought I learned a lot. Never published it until just left it lying dormant until, I don't know, a couple of years ago, and kind of dusted it off and said, I think now I got some, I can look back and reflect on it, if you will.
Sure.
So I kind of divided it up in pieces, and the first two papers from that has now been accepted for publication, and they will be coming out. So this is a really interesting question. Here's what I think I learned. Back in the 1800s, especially on cancer, at that time, there were a lot of people talking about the effect of food and nutrition on cancer, believe it or not.
In the 1800s?
Yes. In other words, we thought we were kind of smug on our committee. We were the first to do this, and the research that we were referring to, the oldest research we found was around 1940, and we thought it was a modern day phenomenon, if you will, that we were interpreting. However, there was a robust amount of research activity going on in the early 1900s. A lot.
Really? That's amazing.
I kept going back and back, and there was also a lot of excellent research done in the 1800s. I just finished reading a book that was published in 1859 that summarized work going on in the 1830s and 40s. And they sort of knew this. They were demonstrating at that time this effect. But quite frankly, they got rejected because during the 1800s, there were two theories of cancer causation, if you will. And I would say this applies to other serious diseases too, but especially for cancer. The two theories were these. Number one theory said that cancer was a local disease, probably caused by something very specific if they could just identify it. And
now, local, you mean geographically?
No, local in the body. There was a local lesion. And so therefore, that being the case, presumably, therefore they could treat it by local means. That is, cut it out. And you can imagine the medical specialty was in favor of that. They were the surgeons.
Oh, sure.
They just argued that case, that it was a local disease. We cut it out. Everybody else get out of the way, so to speak. There was an alternative view, and professionally addressed at the time, that it was called a constitutional disease, meaning that there was something about the whole body involved in this, and this in turn, suggested food as one of those things, and environment and stuff like that. And there were some really excellent publications on this question, this debate, if you will. But as time went on during the 1800s, the surgeons won out, in part because they picked up a couple of other groups of colleagues. For one, they picked up people who believed in chemotherapy, because again, that supported the idea of local disease. Therefore, if we got a drug, if we could just find a drug, we could treat that disease and kill those cancer cells, those nasty cancer cells.
When did they start to learn about chemotherapy? Was that
was
also
first sort of suggested in the late maybe 1890s, 1900. It took up, but then there was yet another group that came into play at that time. It was the radiologists. But that was work of Madame Curie and her husband, who got the Nobel Prize, and so around 1890 or so. And so there were three groups of specialties: surgeons, chemotherapists, and radiologists, who kind of joined forces because it all relied on the same conceptual notion of what cancer really is. And that went on, and that's when the major professional societies were formed in early 1900s, most of them. The American Cancer Society. The guy who founded American Cancer Society, I must tell you, he recommended that nutrition should be studied seriously. He was kicked out of the society. Get rid of that guy. I mean, that was it. End of it.
So they took this whole concept of nutrition and just put it on the back burner and just said, forget about it. We're going to go in this direction.
Because it's not a local disease. I mean, it's not a local concept. They knew that nutrition was complex and they didn't want to hear it. And furthermore, there's another element here too. It's very ugly in my view. And that is, if we know how nutrition works in its complexity, and that's what my work really deals with, if we know how that works, in spite of all that complexity, then people can take responsibility for their own health. Think about that.
Wow. Well, listen, that's the name of our podcast, Take Back Your Health Now, for that specific reason.
That's what it's all about. And so now, the stuff that I've been involved in over the years, it's gone beyond cancer, which was my specialty, but it's, involves heart disease, diabetes, a lot of autoimmune disease and all the rest. And it's the same strategies, the same protocol. Just eat the right damn food. I mean, it's just, that's all we need to do.
Well, Doctor, let's go to that for a second. Then talk to us about the right food. So in order to avoid cancer, all these diseases, what are the right foods? What are the wrong foods?
They're plant-based. Exactly the opposite of what I, coming from the farm that I was on and all that. But it's plant-based. Vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, maybe some nuts and seeds and stuff like that. It's the whole food. The essential part of that proposal is that it's the whole food working together. Because if we take out nutrients out of the food, let's say, and this has been done in more recent years, let's talk about beta-carotene, for example. Foods high in beta-carotene seem to consistently have associated with lower risk for cancer. That was published in the early 80s, 70s and stuff.
Well, say it again.
Foods that are high in beta-carotene. Beta-carotene is the provitamin A.
What would be an example of? Well,
these are all especially the colored foods, the green and leafy vegetables, carrots, obviously. Any of the greens they're loaded with beta carotene, and beta carotene is an excellent antioxidant, which is part of the game plan too, in resisting cancer, by the way. So in any case, there were studies that were published and summarized in 1981, showing, and a bunch of studies all showed that people consuming more beta carotene had less lung cancer, for example. It was pretty consistent. Wow. So then from that early information, that was in the early 80s, and finally around about early 90s, people said, wow, this beta carotene looks really interesting. Why don't we get that, fish that out? It looks like a great chemical. Let's put it in a pill. So that was the birth of much of the nutrient supplement industry, by the way. That was their lead product. And so beta-carotene was put in a pill, and a study was organized between the United States and Finland, funded by the National Cancer Institute, really a very professional study. And so they started giving smokers lung cancer. People get likely to get lung cancer, where there's a lot of pro-oxidation occurring, and so they chose that group of people to study this, and they gave them beta-carotene tablets. And after, they were supposed to go on for a while, but after about 5 years, they started seeing things were disturbing. The people getting the beta-carotene were getting more lung cancer, not less.
They were getting more lung cancer.
They were getting more lung cancer. So that caused a furor of tremendous proportions, I should say. And it really brought a serious question. This whole idea that, people consume more beta-carotene, get more cancer. However, they were missing the point. The point was that the beta-carotene in the food works. not just because of beta carotene, but it's thousands of other things working with it. It's the total package that's working. It was just exemplified by the fact that it had a lot of beta carotene. When you take it out,
so you get all these different cofactors that are actually part of this whole process, and when you're taking the one out, you're forgetting about all the others.
There's a lot of other antioxidants, for example, in this case, and as well as other things. And so that came out, caused a big furor at the time, and beta carotene tablets were taken off the market. And I was involved early on in that because the vitamin supplement industry was really getting going in the 1980s as a result of the report that I was a co-author to. And quite frankly, they were misinterpreting what we had done. They were lying about it, to be honest about it. And they were building an industry. And there was lots of money available to push that industry. So that beta-carotene finding was only the first of now what turns out to be a number of studies showing that nutrient supplements do not work. When nutrients are used in an isolated form like that, they do not have the long-term effects. They may look like they're producing something useful in the beginning for a little bit, but that's not what it is. They actually they can increase the risk of disease that they're intended to target, and that's fairly common now. So
are there? So basically, what you're saying is really you've got to go back to the vegetables, the green leaf food, and just take them as they were intended to be taken.
It's a fact of nature.
Are there any supplemental, vitamins, things like that you do recommend, or is that pretty much across the board?
There's one that I take more or less. I don't know. My wife wants me to take it, but it's vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 is a fairly safe kind of thing. B12 is not produced by animal tissue, whether it's animals that we eat or whether it's our own tissue. It's produced by microorganisms, and so if we don't get enough of these organisms and they're not being nourished enough, they can be in the soil. People who eat this way may be a little bit short on B12. And it's not really serious consequences. We do see some symptoms, and, taking supplementation, at least my clinical colleagues will say this. You can turn around, but other than B12, no, there's nothing. I just turned 83, and I don't take any vitamin supplements. I take no drugs. I don't need drugs or vitamins.
What does your diet look like, Doc? What did you have yesterday, let's say, for breakfast, lunch, dinner?
Well, for breakfast, it's almost the same thing. It's oatmeal, maybe, whole grain, I should say. Then we have pancakes out of whole grain and lots of fresh fruits when in season. When not in season, in wintertime, my wife has a lot of fruits that we pick during the summer and put in the freezer. So it's fruits and grains mostly.
Okay. And do you believe that there should, just in trying to get the concept of what a correct diet would be, do you believe that there should be a small portion of animal like chicken or beef, or none at all?
I don't say that because we have. It's not say that because I know of evidence that that's going to harm everyone all the time. That's not the point. It's just that when we allow a little opening in the doorway to eat the wrong foods, it's almost it's an idea that's been around for a long time. People drift in; they continue to drift into the wrong direction. People who are,
they start going. What about eggs? Just in terms of,
it's really high protein and stuff like that. I mean, sure, some of those foods can serve us well when we're starving. Let's say, but I don't like to say, everybody should be 100% of the time just because we have all the science. No, I don't say it that way. What I say is, and I'm confident in this, that the goal to which we should aspire is really 100% plant-based, because I don't see anybody getting harmed from that. And then the closer we get to it, now we can do things like we can cure heart disease. My colleague, Esselton at the Cleveland Clinic, or Ornish on the West Coast. I mean, they have serious people seriously with heart disease, and they've done a few hundred people like this, and they cure heart disease.
It's amazing to me. It's amazing to me.
So
you take them off.
And the same strategy also reverses type 2 diabetes. People get off their drugs tomorrow. I mean, so fast. And type 1 diabetics, a little more troublesome. because they're missing the cells, the islet cells that produce insulin. But even then, type 1 diabetics who do this, they can actually substantially reduce their use of their need for insulin medication.
Dr. Campbell, I've interviewed a lot of different doctors now on this subject of nutrition. The one area that confuses me a little bit, just because I've had so many different opinions on it, is bread and wheat. We've interviewed one doctor who said the best thing to do is eat bread and potatoes. We've had other doctors that said that if you want to live long, stay away from anything white, any kind of processed breads, grains, things like that. What's your feeling in that relation?
There are two camps. You're right. One camp happens to be those who actually detest everything I say, and they will tell you that we should be on a low-carb diet, which is nonsense, right? Because if we're on a low-carb diet, then we have to be on a high-protein, high-fat diet. And all the data show clearly, the long term, that is nonsense. It's total nonsense. What they have done with that argument when they first introduced it, there was a little bit of truth in it. And as you probably know, you've heard the old expression, the biggest lies is the ones that have a little truth. And
sure.
If they had limited their comment just to refined carbohydrates, that's white flour and sugar, for example, if they had limited their comments to that, fair enough. We should minimize or avoid that kind of carbohydrate. But they just didn't really particularly want to do that because they were supported by an industry that wanted to go back to the animal food, high protein, high fat, lifestyle. So we have to understand the carbohydrate question in that context. Refined carbohydrates, to get back to your question, white bread, sugar and stuff like that, not so good. And we should go for the whole grains. When we do it that way, and most of our carbohydrates, by the way, actually come from vegetables, not just breads. When we consume the whole plant-based foods, if you will, we're getting lots and lots of dietary fiber and lots of other carbohydrates. In fact, the percentage of the total calories we consume that come from carbohydrates ought to be around 70 to 80%. So I'm talking about
70 to 80%.
Yeah, I'm talking about a high carbohydrate diet, not a low carbohydrate diet.
And the carbohydrates that you're talking about are, again, it's not from sugar, it's not from processed breads. You're talking about from where would they get that? Like, where would we get a 70% diet?
Just eat vegetables and fruits and grains.
What about potatoes?
Potatoes too. That? Yes, it's not an issue. It comes back to that concept we talked about before, having to do with reductionism. We tend to look for magic bullets. That's just where our mind works. We look for simple answers. In research and medical practice and stuff, we want to find those straightforward, simple answers, if you will. That's, I guess, pretty natural. It just doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way.
Dr. Campbell, let me ask you, just going back to cancer, one last question on that, and then we'll start to wind down, because I love this interview, and I thank you so much for taking the time to do it with us today. Cancer is on the rise, right? We're seeing much higher numbers, especially in children. I've seen a study that said it was children's cancers are up almost 10,000%. First, is that true, and why is that? Is this related to diet, or are there other factors?
No, I don't believe that's not true. Not for the children, not 10,000% by any stretch of the imagination. It might, that must be a very small sample that somebody made that citation, but that's simply not true. Total cancer is about the same now as it's been in the past. There's some shifting in cancers. For example, lung cancer is coming down because people in the last 50 years have been quitting smoking, for one thing. Stomach cancer, which used to be the number one cancer back in the early part of the 20th century, largely related to the consumption of foods saved in salt brine and before refrigeration. When refrigeration came in, people got away from that. Then they were removing one of the high-risk factors, essentially. And so stomach cancer has dropped a lot. Lung cancer, stomach cancer over the ages, the last 100 years, for example, especially stomach, has dropped a lot. That kind of offsets some increases and some of the others. breast cancer has drifted upwards. Colon cancer has drifted upwards, I think, for the most part. That's a trade-off. I mean, total cancer, by the way, I should tell you, was already high in the early 20th century. Yeah, it was already high at that time compared to other countries. In China, for example, we saw much less cancer in the rural areas of China, less total cancer, although they had a couple of cancers were really high. One was liver cancer, which is basically the risk factor there that predisposed people to liver cancer is hepatitis B virus. That's a chronic infection there. Also, cervical cancer was high in poor areas. Cervical, that's another viral. I mean, let me back up just for a second and clarify some of this, what I'm saying. Cancer is initiated, of course, by various things. It's initiated by chemicals. We tend to think of those a lot. It's also initiated and promoted by certain viruses and other, maybe some infections. However, this is a really important point. And so the extent to which we're exposed to those agents, if you will, depends on where we're living and that kind of thing. But the interesting part of this is that the whole food, plant-based diet, clean living, just vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, stuff like that are, grown nicely and they're not contaminated. That brings all that under control. There's a big study on smoking, for example. People these are heavy smokers consuming a diet that's rich in beta-carotene, that's just an indicator, but rich in vegetables and fruits, their risk of getting lung cancer is almost down to zero.
So, it actually offsets the other risk factors.
I'm not advocating smoking by any stretch of the imagination, but because it can have other effects too. But the dietary effect is so, I'm just a bit overwhelmed to see the effect it has.
So really, this is the answer. So my question to my guests are: we're looking for the Holy Grail of health. If I were to pose that question to you, Doc, what do you perceive the Holy Grail of health to be?
Whole food, plant-based diet, and I'm really confident of that. That is the Holy Grail of health. This was known back in the days of the ancient Greeks, by the way.
What was their diet like?
Pythagoras, you may have heard of that name.
Yes.
Well, he was one of the key people in those ages that was preaching this and saying athletes, benefited from this practice. Eventually, Aristotle said things like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, referring again to the concept I'm talking about. Hippocrates, whose name we use to bless our new doctors.
That's right. You're right. First,
then we forgot though his ideas. And one of his main ideas is let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. That's what he was talking about. So in those days, Socrates, Plato, and others, they were aware that basically consuming plant-based food was what created health.
Wow. Dr. Campbell, this was an amazing interview. I want to thank you so much. How would people that want to know more about you, know about your books, how would they get in touch with you?
We have a website. We've got an online teaching program called Plant. The name of the organization is in my name. I didn't care for that much, but my colleagues convinced us. T. Colin Campbell Center for Nutrition Studies. And the URL for that is Nutrition Studies, that's plural, nutritionstudies.org. And we offer an online course. Been very exciting. We do this in partnership with Cornell University's online program. And Cornell, of which I'm still a professor emeritus there, that course that we have is one of about 200 online courses that Cornell offers. Ours is number one.
Whoa, amazing. Amazing. Well, listen, you could see the interest in this subject.
This is happening. By the way, our course, we offer 30 Category 1 continuing medical education credits for doctors. So if there's any doctors listen to this, we have a lot of doctors in our course. This is one way they can get up to speed a little bit, at least get introduced to the idea. And that's one place that if you want to check out what I'm doing. My younger son, who co-authored the China study with me, went off then. He was in theater at the time, a good writer. But he went off to med school. Now he's finished up. He's finished up his residency and everything else. He's now at the University of Rochester Medical Center. And together with his wife, who's also a physician, they're heading up the first program in nutrition and medicine in the country.
Wow, this is amazing. Well,
it's focused on this idea. It's very exciting. We're planning some research and stuff like that. And I'm very pleased with the University of Rochester, the senior people. In this case, it was the CEOs, I understand, that recruited him. But so he's got that going, and the biggest part of all this stuff is raising funding. We got an amazing research project underway right now. Need more funding, but that's one thing. My oldest son, who was trained in government and economics, mostly Cornell, he is the one that directed the film called Plant Pure Nation. You may not know it, but the producer of Four Silver Knives. Have you seen Four Silver Knives?
Okay, no, I don't.
Four Silver Knives was a film that was a takeoff of our work. It came out in 2011. It went to the top. It may be close to being the most watched documentary in our country in the last 5 years.
I have heard of it. Yes, Forks Over Knives. I'm sorry. Yes, I absolutely.
A lot of it, came from my study. My colleagues also were involved and obviously being interviewed for that. That's been all over the place. It's hard to know how many people watch it. At least 20 million. But that came out, and the producer of that film is also the producer of the second film that was directed by my oldest son, Nelson. And in fact, I was just with the producer this last week and down in the Caribbean. But that second film went to the question concerning why haven't we heard this before? And that.
Okay, I lost that. Say that one more time. I lost
that second part. Film addressed the question, why haven't we heard this before? And it takes off from an invitation that I had to speak to the Kentucky legislature. One of the senior legislators in the Kentucky Senate heard me speak a couple of times, wanted me to come there. I invited my friend to go along with me. That's Dr. Esselton, who's actually done the amazing work in reversing heart disease. So we spoke to the on the floor of the Kentucky legislators, got a good reception. But then this is all caught on camera. Subsequent to that, the lobbyists got involved. I won't say more. That's what the new movie is about, because it tends to show what role lobbyists play in blocking.
Well, you've been fighting this your whole life.
Yeah,
you've been fighting these people your whole life.
I don't consider it a fight, really. It's their fight. I think I know what I'm doing. They don't really particularly care for what I do, some of them, but anyhow, that's understandable. So in any case, that film then led to the development of a food line, a line of frozen foods that is now being picked up by a major company. Wow. I can't say the name at the moment. It's going to be launched here shortly, and it's been test run online. And then they also organized a group of wellness groups around the country and abroad. He calls them pods. I think there's like 350 to 400 pods now that have formed. And they're all being organized into a network that's maintained, through our internet, obviously, social media, internet, stuff like that. And so the idea is that these organizations, will maintain their independence going forward. But on the other hand, they're all focused on one idea, and that's to spread the word. And some people may wish to do that, through their legislatures. Some people may want to do it just by holding a potluck supper or something. Whatever the case may be, that network of pods, I love it. It's just now getting off the ground. And there's a nonprofit that's on. So we got that going. The medical school thing with the younger son, the movies, and the pod with my older son. And there's cookbooks. There's a number of cookbooks out by our daughter and a couple of daughters-in-law.
Dr. Campbell, what a great family. I mean, your whole family is involved.
I have to,
you must be very proud, sir.
The one that drove us all in this direction is my wife. She's really played a major role in this. She just makes sure that we're eating the right thing. And And it's really just transitioned our diet over the years as this information became available. And there's 21 of us now in the family, counting children, grandchildren, ourselves, and all of us do the same thing.
Well, what a great blessing. Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for being on the show, and thank you for a life well spent.
Getting involved.
We all appreciate that.
And doing the work that needs to be done. Is that's getting out to the public. It's what's needed.
Absolutely.
This episode is sponsored by New Jersey Foot and Ankle Center in Orodo, New Jersey. Remember, when you have a foot problem, you've got a foot doctor in the family. Weekend and evening appointments are available. Call us at 201-261-9445. Once again, that's 201-261-9445. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes over at drdanspeaks.com. If you're loving the show, head over to iTunes and leave us a review, and we'll catch you next time. Voiceovers for this episode were provided by Randy Ramos Jr. To see and hear more of his work, visit randyramosjr.com, jr.com, 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 jr.com.